Welcome my channel. Tonight's story is one of the darkest and most shocking acts of revenge buried in American history. On Christmas morning in 1851, inside a church meant for peace and prayer, a single brutal act changed everything. And what followed became a massacre so severe it was quietly erased from records. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe, because uncovering stories like this requires deep digging into fragmented court notes, church archives, and eyewitness accounts that were never meant to be found. This is not folklore. This is a true historical nightmare that still chills historians today. The morning of Christmas Day, 1851, began like countless others across the American South, cold, quiet, and wrapped in the fragile promise of peace. Church bells rang through the small rural community, calling families from scattered farms and cabins toward the white-washed wooden church at the center of town. For many, it was the one day a year when grudges were set aside, weapons were left behind, and even the most hardened men sat shoulder to shoulder in prayer. Among those who entered that church was a man holding his young son by the hand, a boy no more than 12 years old, dressed in his cleanest clothes and nervous in the way children often are in places meant for silence. The church was full. Candles flickered along the walls. Hymns echoed through the rafters, and the smell of pine and cold earth clung to coats hung near the door. Witnesses later said nothing felt unusual at first. The boy sat beside his father on a hard wooden bench near the middle of the room, quietly listening as the preacher spoke of forgiveness, mercy, and the meaning of Christ's birth. But beneath that calm surface, old tensions sat heavily in the room, disputes over land, labor, debts, and punishments that had never been resolved. Christmas did not erase hatred. It only forced it into silence. As the service continued, a small disturbance broke out near the front pews. A group of men whispered sharply among themselves, their attention fixed not on the sermon, but on the father and son seated behind them. No one stood, no one spoke aloud, but several witnesses later recalled seeing one of the men glance back repeatedly, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking. The preacher's voice droned on, unaware that something terrible was already unfolding. Then, without warning, the sound of a struggle cut through the hymn. A chair scraped hard against the wooden floor. Before anyone could react, a man lunged backward into the aisle. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it shattered the church forever. The boy stood up instinctively, startled by the movement, and that moment sealed his fate. A blade flashed in the candlelight. There was no warning cry, no chance to flee. The attack was fast, deliberate, and horrifyingly precise. The boy collapsed in front of the altar, his blood soaking into the church floor as screams erupted around him. Women cried out, men shouted. Some rushed forward, others froze in disbelief. The preacher dropped to his knees, his Bible falling from his hands. The father reached his son just as life left the boy's body, his hands trembling as he pressed against a wound no prayer could undo. Witnesses later said the church went silent in that instant, not peaceful silence, but the kind that comes when reality becomes too terrible to accept. The attackers did not flee immediately. According to surviving accounts, they stood there, breathing heavily, faces pale, as if even they were shocked by what they had done. The act had been intentional, rooted in an old grievance involving the boy's father, but no one expected it to happen there, in that sacred place on Christmas morning. When they finally ran, Chaos followed. Some men chased them, others locked the doors in panic, and many simply stared at the boy's lifeless body on the church floor, unable to move. The father did not scream. He did not collapse. Those who saw him that day said something inside him broke cleanly and completely. He held his son for a long moment, then gently laid the body down as if the boy were only sleeping. His eyes were dry, his face hollow. When the authorities arrived hours later, they found him sitting alone near the altar, staring at the blood-stained boards, silent and unmoving. He answered no questions. He showed no emotion. The killing of a child inside a church on Christmas Day sent shockwaves through the region. News spread quickly, carried by whispers and fearful retellings. Some claimed it was a drunken act of rage. Others insisted it was planned long before the church bells rang that morning. What everyone agreed on was this: a line had been crossed that could never be undone. Even in a time accustomed to violence, this act was different. It violated not just the law, but every moral boundary the community believed it had. By nightfall, the boy was dead, the attackers were in hiding, and the church stood empty, its doors closed, its floor scrubbed in vain. But the real aftermath had only just begun, because while the town mourned the child, they failed to notice what was quietly taking shape inside the father. The murder of his son was not the end of the story. It was the spark. And before another Christmas dawned, the grief that began on that church floor would turn into a revenge so devastating that it would leave 67 people dead and an entire chapter of history deliberately buried. After the church emptied and the body of his son was carried away, the father disappeared into silence. Those who knew him expected rage, shouting, or at least tears, but none came. Instead, he withdrew completely, as if something inside him had gone cold. For days, he spoke to no one. He did not attend the burial. He did not confront the men suspected of the killing. He did not ask the sheriff for justice. To the outside world, it looked like a man broken beyond repair. But those closest to him would later say the opposite was true. Something had hardened. Something terrifyingly calm had taken control. In the weeks that followed Christmas, the town watched him carefully. Violence often bred more violence in those times, and everyone expected retaliation. Yet he moved through the days like a ghost. He returned to work, kept his head down, and showed no outward signs of grief. When people offered condolences, he nodded politely and walked away. When asked about the men responsible, he only said, "God saw it." That answer unsettled people more than any threat could have. At night, however, his true transformation began. According to fragments of later testimony, he stopped sleeping. Neighbors reported seeing a candle burning in his window until dawn. Others heard him walking the roads alone, long after midnight, visiting places tied to the men who had been in the church that morning. He listened more than he spoke, learning who had held the blade, who had blocked the aisle, who had shouted for silence, and who had done nothing at all. In his mind, guilt spread wider than the single hand that struck his son. What broke him completely was the realization that no one would truly be punished. The church elders urged forgiveness. The sheriff claimed there was confusion about what had happened. Witnesses began changing their stories, suddenly unsure of faces they had clearly seen days earlier. Some said the killing was an accident. Others whispered that the boy's father had provoked it. That was the moment grief turned into resolve. The law, the church, and the community had chosen comfort over truth. If justice would not come through them, it would come through him. He began to plan with chilling patience. This was not the blind rage of a grieving parent. It was something far more dangerous. He mapped routines, learned habits, counted numbers. He knew who gathered where, who drank together, who prayed together, who celebrated together. Christmas, he realized, had made them careless. It had gathered them all in one place. And next Christmas, or any holy day, could do the same. Those who later tried to reconstruct his actions described his mind as methodical, almost ritualistic. He didn't see his plan as murder. He saw it as balance. In his thinking, one innocent life had been taken in a place meant for mercy. The weight of that sin did not belong to one man alone. It belonged to everyone who allowed it to happen, everyone who protected the killers, everyone who washed the blood from the church floor and pretended nothing had changed. His revenge would not be loud or impulsive. It would be precise. During this period, he became deeply observant of religious language. He listened to sermons, noted scripture, and twisted their words into justification. If forgiveness was demanded without justice, then justice would come without forgiveness. If blood could be spilled in a church without consequence, then no place was truly sacred anymore. This belief erased his last hesitation. Once that line was crossed, there was no return. Several people later recalled strange encounters with him during those months. He asked calm, unsettling questions. Where were you sitting that morning? Who stood when the shouting started? Who closed the doors? Each question sounded innocent, but together they formed a picture. Some laughed it off. Others grew uneasy. None imagined what he was assembling in his mind. By the time spring arrived, the father no longer thought of himself as a grieving man. He believed he had been chosen by circumstance to act where others had failed. His son's death was no longer just a personal loss. It was proof that the moral order had collapsed. And when order collapses, someone must restore it, no matter the cost. This was the true beginning of the massacre, not the moment weapons were raised, but the moment grief stopped being pain and became purpose. The killing in the church did not just take a child's life. It created something far more dangerous, a man who believed he was carrying out judgment, not revenge. And once that belief took hold, the number of dead no longer mattered. Only balance did. Once the decision was made, everything about the father changed. Not outwardly, but inwardly, with terrifying precision. He understood that rage would expose him, and speed would ruin what he intended to do. If he was going to strike, it had to be planned carefully, quietly, and completely. This would not be a single act of retaliation. It would be a reckoning. He began by studying people, not as neighbors or fellow worshippers, but as patterns. He watched who gathered together and when, who trusted whom, and who felt safe because they believed the past had been buried. Holidays, church meetings, seasonal markets, these were the moments when vigilance dropped. He noted which men carried weapons and which left them behind, convinced that faith or tradition would protect them. The irony was not lost on him. The same belief that had made the church attack possible would make what came next devastating. He also understood geography. He learned every path, every narrow road, every place where sound carried, and every place where it didn't. He knew which homes were isolated, which families slept close together, and which gatherings could be trapped once entered. None of this was hurried. Months passed. Seasons shifted. To the town, it looked like life was returning to normal. That illusion was exactly what he needed. What made his planning especially disturbing was how ordinary he remained in public. He helped neighbors. He attended services. He spoke respectfully to those who had once averted their eyes from his son's blood. This wasn't deception born from fear. It was discipline. He wanted them comfortable. He wanted them unguarded. Each smile, each polite nod, was part of the preparation. At night, his planning took on a darker clarity. He wrote nothing down, knowing records could betray him. Instead, he memorized names, faces, actions. He categorized them not by who struck the blow, but by who enabled it. The man who held the knife was only one part of the crime. Those who blocked the aisle, those who shouted for silence, those who changed their stories afterward, all of them were marked. Even those who said nothing, who watched and did nothing while a child bled on a church floor, were not innocent in his eyes. He also planned timing with almost religious obsession. The date mattered. The setting mattered. What happened to his son had violated a sacred space and a sacred moment. His response, he believed, needed the same symbolic weight. A day of celebration. A time when people felt protected by tradition. That was when the reckoning would feel unavoidable, undeniable. He wanted the survivors to understand exactly why it was happening. Those closest to him sensed something was wrong, but couldn't explain it. He spoke rarely about his son, but when he did, his words were unsettlingly calm. He trusted that place. He once said quietly. So did they. No one pressed him further. They assumed time had dulled the pain. They were wrong. Time had sharpened it. He acquired what he needed slowly, in pieces, never enough to raise suspicion. In that era, weapons were common, but he avoided anything that could be traced directly to him. He relied on familiarity, tools, knives, firearms already present in homes and farms. He planned to move through places where his presence would not immediately alarm anyone. Familiarity would be his greatest weapon. Perhaps the most chilling part of his preparation was how he rehearsed the moment emotionally. He did not imagine screaming or chaos. He imagined silence. He imagined faces recognizing him too late. He imagined the shock of understanding, not fear, but realization. In his mind, that realization was justice. By the time the final pieces fell into place, he no longer saw himself as a man planning murder. He saw himself as completing an unfinished event that had begun in the church. To him, the massacre was not a separate act. It was the second half of the same story. The first half had ended with a child's blood on holy ground. The second would end with a number so large it could not be ignored, no matter how hard history tried to bury it. Keynote 3 is where the story turns from tragedy into inevitability. From this point forward, nothing could stop what was coming, not law, not faith, not fear. The planning was complete, and once the day arrived, it would unfold exactly as he intended, leaving behind not just bodies, but a silence that would haunt the town for generations. When the chosen morning finally arrived, it did not begin with shouting or gunfire. It began quietly, almost peacefully, the way most massacres do when they are carefully planned. The town woke as it always did, unaware that this day had already been marked. People gathered in familiar places, greeting one another, laughing, sharing food, celebrating life, believing themselves safe, because nothing bad had happened in months. That sense of safety was the final mistake. The father moved through the town without haste, Witnesses later described seeing him early that morning, calm, focused, almost serene. No one suspected anything, because he looked like a man going about ordinary business. That ordinariness was intentional. He understood that panic spreads faster than violence, and he needed time for people to gather, time for numbers to grow. The first attack came suddenly, but not loudly. It happened in a place where several of the men connected to the church killing had gathered together. Those nearby would later say they heard a brief struggle, a sharp sound, and then silence. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late for the first victims. Their deaths were quick, deliberate, and without warning. There was no speech, no announcement, no explanation, only action. From there, the violence spread outward like ripples in water. He moved with purpose, not randomly, following the mental map he had built over months. Each location had been chosen because it held multiple people tied, directly or indirectly, to the crime against his son. Some were in homes. Some were in communal spaces. Some were caught while traveling between gatherings. The attacks were fast, relentless, and terrifyingly controlled. Panic erupted as word spread that people were being killed, but confusion followed close behind. No one understood who was attacking or why. Some thought it was an uprising. Others believed rival groups were fighting. The lack of clarity made escape nearly impossible. People ran toward places they believed were safe, only to find themselves trapped among others who had already been marked. By midday, the town had descended into chaos. Bells rang, not for worship, but as warnings. Gunshots echoed through streets and fields. Doors were barred. Families hid. But the father did not seek indiscriminate slaughter. He sought completion. Those who tried to reason with him, to plead or pray, were met with the same cold resolve. In his mind, prayer had already failed once, in a church, on Christmas morning. Survivors later described his expression during the attacks as deeply unsettling. There was no visible anger, no shouting, no triumph, just focus. It was as if he were performing a task that had to be done, not a crime. That composure frightened people more than rage ever could. They realized they weren't facing a man who had lost control. They were facing someone who believed completely in what he was doing. As the death toll rose, attempts were made to stop him. Armed men formed groups, hoping to corner him, but they were uncoordinated and terrified. He knew the terrain better than anyone. He anticipated their movements. Several of those who tried to intervene never returned. By the time authorities from neighboring areas arrived, the worst was already over. When the violence finally ended, the count stood at 67 dead. 67 lives lost in a single, horrifying stretch of time. Some were directly involved in the church killing. Others were connected by silence, protection, or proximity. A few may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, casualties of a revenge that had grown larger than its original wound. The father himself was never officially captured. Some accounts say he vanished into the woods, wounded but alive. Others claim he surrendered quietly and was executed without trial. Records contradict each other, and some disappear entirely. What remains consistent is the aftermath. The town was changed forever. Families were shattered, homes stood empty, and an unspoken agreement settled over the survivors. This story would not be told openly. The massacre was too brutal, too morally complicated, too embarrassing for the institutions that had failed to prevent it. A child had been murdered in a church, and justice had been replaced by bloodshed on a scale no one wanted to remember. So the records were buried, the details softened, the numbers questioned. But the truth lingered in memory. People remembered the silence that followed. They remembered how Christmas never felt the same again. And they remembered that the massacre did not come from madness alone. It came from a grief that was ignored, a crime that was excused, and a moment when a man decided that if the world would not honor the life of his son, then it would be forced to remember his death through the lives of 67 others. When the killing finally stopped, the town did not breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. The scale of what had happened was impossible to process. 67 people were dead. Families were shattered. Streets and fields were stained with blood. And yet, within hours, a different kind of urgency took over. Not justice, not mourning, but control. The local authorities realized quickly that this was not a crime they knew how to explain, and worse, not one they knew how to survive politically or morally if the full truth came out. The first problem was the origin of the violence. Once investigators began tracing names and connections, an uncomfortable pattern emerged. A significant number of the dead had been present in the church on Christmas morning. Others had helped shield the attackers. Some had pressured witnesses to stay silent. The massacre was not random, it was connected, deliberate, and rooted in a failure of law and faith. To admit that openly would mean admitting that a child had been murdered in a church and that the community had chosen silence over justice. That truth threatened everyone in power. Official statements began changing almost immediately. Early reports spoke of mob violence and confusion. Later versions described a sudden riot or outbreak of lawlessness. The word revenge was avoided. The word church was softened or omitted entirely. The death toll itself became unstable. Some records listed fewer than 50 dead. Others reduced the number further. In a few surviving documents, the massacre was reframed as multiple unrelated incidents spread across several days, a deliberate attempt to strip it of its cause and its meaning. Witnesses were pressured into cooperation. Some were threatened with arrest for their own minor offenses if they spoke too clearly. Others were warned that telling the full story would invite more violence, more retaliation. Ministers urged congregations to let the dead rest and focus on rebuilding, carefully avoiding any mention of the boy whose death had started it all. The church that had been the site of the original killing was quietly closed for repairs, and when it reopened, the blood-stained floorboards were gone. The father's fate became another point of manipulation. Without him, the story could not be anchored. Some officials claimed he died during the massacre. Others said he fled and was never seen again. A few whispered that he was executed in secret, without trial, to ensure he could never speak. No grave was ever confirmed. No arrest record survived intact. His disappearance allowed the authorities to reshape the narrative. A faceless monster committing senseless violence, rather than a grieving man responding to a buried crime. Outside the town, rumors spread faster than facts. Neighboring communities heard exaggerated versions, stripped of context. The massacre became a warning about chaos, about what happens when order breaks down, never about what happens when justice is denied. That framing was useful. It shifted blame away from institutions and onto fear itself. The message was clear. Stability mattered more than truth. Behind closed doors, officials argued over records. Some wanted everything destroyed. Others feared that erasing too much would raise suspicion. The compromise was selective survival. Enough paperwork to explain deaths, but not enough to explain why. Court documents vanished. Church logs were altered. Personal letters were confiscated or burned. By the end of the year, the massacre existed officially as a tragedy without a cause. For the survivors, this was a second violence. Those who had lost family members were denied the truth. Those who had witnessed the church killing were denied acknowledgement. The boy's name faded first, then the father's. Eventually, even the word massacre became taboo. People learned quickly that speaking too openly brought consequences: social isolation, suspicion, sometimes worse. Silence became a form of survival, and yet, despite every attempt to suppress it, the story did not disappear. It changed shape. It became a warning told in fragments, a rumor shared late at night, a sentence cut short when outsiders approached. Elders spoke of a bad Christmas and a day the town broke. Children were told never to ask too many questions about the old church or the year certain families vanished. Historians who later tried to piece it together ran into walls, contradictory numbers, missing names, events that didn't align unless one accepted the unspoken truth underneath. That truth was simple and devastating. The massacre was not an inexplicable outbreak of violence. It was the consequence of a community choosing silence after a child was murdered in a place meant to protect him. In the end, the authorities failed to explain what happened because explanation would have required confession. It would have required admitting that justice had been denied when it mattered most. So instead, they buried the story, smoothed its edges, and hoped time would do the rest. But time did not erase it. It only pushed it deeper, where it waited. And that is why the massacre still haunts history, not just because of the 67 who died, but because of the single child whose death everyone agreed to forget, and the terrible price that forgetting demanded. After the violence ended and the bodies were counted, what followed was not closure, but absence. People began to disappear, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, in ways that were easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. A family packed up overnight and left town without saying goodbye. A witness who had spoken too freely suddenly took work far away and was never heard from again. A deputy listed in early reports vanished from later records, his name scratched out and replaced with another. These disappearances were not officially connected to the massacre, but everyone understood they were part of it. Grief itself became dangerous. Families who asked too many questions were advised to move on. Mothers who demanded answers about their sons were told the past was too painful to reopen. Funerals were rushed. Some victims were buried in unmarked graves to avoid attention. Others were transported elsewhere, ensuring there would be no single place where mourning or memory could gather strength. The town learned quickly that survival now depended on silence. The physical landscape changed as well. Buildings connected to the events were altered or removed. Homes where killings had occurred were torn down or sold cheaply to outsiders who didn't know their history. Roads were rerouted. Fields were reclaimed. The church at the center of everything became the most uncomfortable symbol of all. For years, it stood mostly empty, its congregation thinned by death and departure. Eventually, it was renamed, renovated, and rededicated, as if a new coat of paint could overwrite what had happened inside its walls. Official records reflected the same erasure. Census data suddenly showed population drops that didn't align with natural causes. Death certificates listed vague explanations: illness, accidents, unknown circumstances. Court dockets skipped dates where hearings should have appeared. Newspapers outside the region referenced trouble and disturbances, but no follow-up ever came. Within the town, local papers avoided the topic altogether, focusing instead on harvests, weather, and church socials. Life on paper returned to normal with unsettling speed. What made the forgetting possible was not just fear, but convenience. The massacre was morally complicated. It didn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil that institutions prefer. A child had been killed in a sacred space. Justice had failed. Revenge had followed. Devastating and disproportionate. To remember it honestly would mean admitting that law, faith, and community all broke down at once. It was easier, far easier, to pretend it had never truly happened. Over time, the story fractured. Details blurred. Numbers changed. Names were lost. What remained survived as whispers and warnings. Older residents spoke carefully, choosing their words like stepping stones across deep water. They didn't deny the massacre outright, they redirected. They spoke of a bad year, or a time when people lost their way. When pressed, they changed the subject or fell silent. Children learned that curiosity about certain families or certain places brought tension into the room. Historians who later tried to reconstruct the event encountered gaps that felt intentional. Sources contradicted each other too neatly. Documents stopped mid-sentence. Margins were altered. Some archives claimed to have no materials at all from that period, despite clear evidence that records should exist. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer it became that forgetting was not accidental. It had been managed. And yet, forgetting was never complete. Trauma has a way of leaving marks even when stories are buried. Generations later, people still avoided certain paths at night. Certain surnames were rare, their absence more noticeable than their presence would have been. Christmas celebrations were subdued for decades, stripped of joy without explanation. Outsiders sensed something wrong but couldn't name it. The final disappearance was the truth itself. Without a single official account, without a trial, without a memorial, the massacre slipped out of public consciousness. It became too vague to argue with, too fragmented to teach, too uncomfortable to commemorate. History prefers clean narratives, and this one refused to be clean. So it was set aside. But history does not require permission to endure. It waits. In diaries hidden in trunks. In letters never mailed. In oral fragments passed down with warnings attached. The massacre survived not as a headline, but as a shadow long quiet and impossible to fully erase. That is why it still matters. Not because of the violence alone, but because of what came after. The disappearances, the silence, the collective decision to move forward without reckoning. When history forgets something this severe, it isn't because the event lacked importance. It's because remembering it would have forced people to confront who they were and who they chose not to be.